read-only domain controllers. In this nugget, we're going to discuss one of the coolest features of Windows Server 2008, and that is the read-only domain controller, which is a great way to secure your branch offices. We'll start off with taking a look at an overview of what a read-only domain controller is and some of the benefits that it provides. We'll take a look at some of the prerequisites to keep in mind before you actually go about installing a read-only domain controller. Some considerations also to keep in mind in terms of your planning. We'll take a look also at some credential caching issues. You can store passwords on a read-only domain controller, but most of the time you don't. That's what this relates to, is storing select passwords. And then there's administrative role separation. This is going to allow kind of generic users to be able to fully administer a read-only domain controller in the absence of a full-time IT staff. Then we'll take a look at actually doing an installation and performing a few demos of a read-only domain controller. Alright, let's take a look here at a dilemma that we often have had with branch offices. You see, here I've got a single site right here. Maybe it's a big hub site. It's got, 8,000 users, 450 groups, 40 universal groups, and 8,300 computers. These are just kind of, arbitrary numbers that I came up with. And we've seen this diagram in a previous nugget in the same series, but it still works for what I'm going to talk about here. Now, here I've probably got, dozens of domain controllers, but let's just say I've got one domain controller here. It's a global catalog server and my bridgehead server. And then down here, I've got a remote office. I have to have this office. They have a very important job function, but really there's only 12 people down there. And 2 groups, no universal groups, and 15 computers. And then they have this file share down here as well. So it doesn't seem like it would make any sense to put a domain controller down there just for those 12 users. So what we might do is we might just say, hey, we've got a WAN link. Let's just process all of the logon traffic across this WAN link. Now, that can be okay, except that now we're using this WAN link for all of our Kerberos activity, all of our logon activity, all of our authentications, all that kind of stuff is taking place. And in addition, if these people up here in the Phoenix site also have to access this file share down in Goldfield, well, they're probably saturating this WAN link as well. So what's going to happen is people here try to log on. They don't have their own local domain controller. Wow, it could take a long time to finally log on across this slow WAN link because it's so competitive. What's more, if this WAN link goes down, then this user, they could probably still log on with cached credentials if they've logged onto their workstation at any time in the past. But now when they try to access this file share, guess what? They're not going to be able to, even though it's even in their same site and everything, and they can probably, look across the room and see that file share, that file server somewhere. They can't access it because since the WAN link is down, there's no domain controller available to validate their credentials, to validate their group membership. Therefore, they just plain cannot access that resource until the WAN link comes back. So what are these poor people going to do? Well, let's take a look. We can change all of this. And we could put in just another domain controller down here. That would just be another normal domain controller, another single domain controller probably. It's also going to be a global catalog server. Got a global catalog server here, global catalog server here. And we looked earlier at the fact that with this going on, now we've got a very busy domain up here, rather a very busy site where there's lots of changes going on with all these users in Active Directory. So the global catalog might get updated quite frequently, and we have to replicate all of that stuff over this WAN link down to this small office. Well, once again, now we've got probably an inordinate amount of replication traffic that could take place there. But we might have to deal with that again, especially if we have Outlook clients down here and Exchange and stuff like that. So, still not possibly ideal though. And this gets worse because in really small offices like this, very often the physical security for that domain controller is not very good. It might just be in a little closet somewhere. Might not even be behind a locked door. Could be underneath somebody's desk. Who knows what. So if somebody breaks in after hours and steals that domain controller, if they have, if they're educated about this, they'll know what they've got, and they could possibly get secrets off of this domain controller. And it's not just going to be for these 12 users. It's going to be for everybody in the entire forest, including these users and these users. Or rather, in the entire domain. So this is very security sensitive. Now, in order to remedy that kind of situation, what Microsoft has done is they've come up with something called a read-only domain controller. With the read-only domain controller, or what we usually refer to as just an RODC, then what we do is we still have our normal domain controllers up here. I guess I shouldn't have erased that. And then we'll have another domain controller down here, but it's read-only domain controller. An advantage of this, and this is something important to remember, is that the replication for this takes place in only one direction. This direction. That since it's read-only, then this domain controller will never have any changes made to it. Therefore, it never replicates back this direction. This becomes relevant if we have, a bunch of other little branch offices out here, all also replicating to that same bridgehead server right here. If we wanted to limit the inbound replication load on this bridgehead server, then maybe, and if there was other good reasons to make these branch offices have read-only domain controllers, then we would only have outbound replication to each one of these locations. They would never have inbound replication, and therefore, again, adding an additional burden to that bridgehead server here in my hub site. Likewise, if this read-only domain controller gets stolen, and that again is a big part of the read-only domain controller's advantages, is the security of it. But if it gets stolen, it doesn't really have any secrets, because although it has all the Active Directory objects on it, one thing that it really does not have is the passwords that would appear on a normal domain controller. So there's no real secrets down here. Now there's some exception to that. We'll cover that here in a little while. In fact, let's go ahead and address some of the things to think about when it comes to a read-only domain controller. First of all, as the name implies, and as I've already said, it's read-only data, so it's a read-only directory database. It can also support read-only DNS zones. Now, because of the fact that it's read-only in both of those respects, if someone does steal it with malicious intent, then they're not going to be able to poison my copy of Active Directory, because since it's read-only, they have no way of writing to it. So they can't enter in false records there, or enter in false resource records in my DNS zones either. So we kind of pretty much just locked them out, patently with these two options right there in the read-only domain controller. Also, only the passwords. We get all the other advantages are there. The sysfile is there, group policy objects are there, but the passwords are omitted. Okay, and by the way, that thing that I just mentioned, the group policy objects, that is an important item there. So if I go back and take a look at that, on the read-only domain controller, since we have the sysvol, okay, which contains group policy object data, and since we have group policy objects themselves, my users here in computers, when they log on, they can get all of their group policy processing directly from this domain controller, again, instead of having to go across a WAN link. Okay, all right, let's go ahead and take a look also at some other things here. Updates are replicated again to the read-only domain controller, only outbound from the hub in this case, and as we saw in my diagram. So it's one-way replication, and it can significantly reduce the load on a hub bridgehead server. The ideal locations for this are probably, again, going to be smaller branch offices where they possibly don't have their own IT staff. They may have somebody there that's pretty good. If you call them up and tell them that you need their help to troubleshoot something, yeah, they can probably put their hands on the keyboard and click on what you tell them to click on and type in what you tell them to type in. Also, again, for less secure locations, because, again, they may get broken into. Might be easy for people to run off and steal the servers. They don't have biometric security and a secure keypad or smart card access to some elaborate server room somewhere. So for that reason, rather than building up security in that respect, which you might not be able to afford, we simply put servers in there that are worth less, except for their hardware investment, but they're worth less in terms of the actual Active Directory data than they would otherwise be if they were a full read-write domain controller. And then before you decide you want to install a read-only domain controller, keep in mind some prerequisites first of all. Number one, the PDC emulator in your domain must be a Windows Server 2008 PDC emulator. That's just because of certain ways that it has to communicate with a read-only domain controller. Windows Server 2003 PDC emulators would not be able to do that. So, PDC emulator, Windows Server 2008. Also, it's going to receive its updates only from a Windows Server 2008 domain controller, not from a Windows Server 2003 domain controller. Now, if you're used to just setting up domains in labs and things like that, you might have set up all Windows Server 2008 from the get-go. But in the real world, very often there are Windows 2000 or Windows Server 2003 domain controllers that are still out there. So in your topology, let me go back into this. In your topology, you need to make sure that your read-only domain controller is connected to a Windows Server 2008 domain controller. Whereas, in some cases there might be another hub site over here, for example. And if this were a Windows Server 2003 domain controller, we would not want to pull data from this one. We would want to pull data from this one, which is a Windows Server 2008. And the way this is done, by the way, it would be again by your site link cost. The lower site link cost is going to be preferred and recognized as the faster connection. So if this has a site link cost of 5 and this has a site link cost of 10, then it's going to attempt to replicate from this particular domain controller. And then other thing to think about here is for your domain functional level and your forest functional level both. They have to be at either Windows Server 2008 or Windows Server 2003 domain and forest functional level. Okay, so either one of those will work. In other words, as long as it's not Windows 2000 something. Okay. Also, you have to prepare the schema to be able to accept a read-only domain controller. We talked about this in a previous nugget, but you would run adprep with rodc prep. And this would prepare the schema to accept a read-only domain controller. Now also, you only have one read-only domain controller per domain per site. Okay, so let's go back to our diagram here to show you that. Here, I've got a single domain, and since I've got a read-only domain controller already for nuggetlab.com, I can only have one. I can't put in 2 read-only domain controllers for that same domain. But if I had another domain somewhere else, cbtnuggets.com, then I could have another read-only domain controller here for cbtnuggets.com. Okay, so one read-only domain controller per domain per site. Okay. All right, that's our prerequisites, and you need to keep those things in mind, especially for exam purposes. Also, once again, take some other considerations into account. If you have Outlook clients in the site and Exchange and all of that, then you might want to make the read-only domain controller a global catalog, and there will be an option during installation that will allow you to do that, or you can do it after the fact. Also, when you install a read-only domain controller, by default, universal group membership caching will be enabled. So that's kind of a handy feature we talked about previously, which really goes hand in hand very nicely with a read-only domain controller, giving their caching nature, if you will. Also, you want to plan your topology away from Windows Server 2003, and that's what I was showing you earlier in this diagram, where we wanted to plan it away from this Windows Server 2003 domain controller by using a higher site link cost and forcing it over to the lower site link cost where my Windows Server 2008 domain controller is instead. Now that I cleaned up here a little bit to go back to a simpler diagram, but let's also take a look at what happens when a user logs on. Here I've got my user account, and they log on, they enter in their username and their password. Well, because of the site location, it's going to send that query, send that credential to the read-only domain controller. But since it doesn't store passwords at the read-only domain controller, it has to act as a relay agent and send the credentials up here to a domain controller that does know the user's password. When this domain controller validates that the account is good, then it will send that back down to the read-only domain controller. For all practical purposes, the workstation that this user logs onto thinks that this domain controller performed all the authentication and logged that user on. This domain controller will also have the ticket granting ticket authentication capability in Kerberos. And what that means is there's an account that exists here, a user account that exists that's not something that anybody actually logs on with, but it's a user account that's used to distribute tickets to users. For example, if this user tries to access this file share, then they need to be able to present a ticket, and the ticket granting ticket process will provide that ticket for this user. This again is going to take place from the read-only domain controller. We don't go up here to this domain controller to get that ticket. Another thing to keep in mind is that this ticket granting ticket has a unique identifier with it, so that if this read-only domain controller is stolen, for example, right from underneath our noses, then up here when we go to our recovery scenarios, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, then this ticket granting ticket identifier becomes null and void, and the user would have to obtain a new ticket granting ticket from some other domain controller. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that the user's password is not actually stored on the read-only domain controller. However, there is some exception to that. You can use something called credential caching. And what happens in this case is the read-only domain controller actually does verify the credentials just the way I just showed you. It does reach out to a domain controller across a WAN link. Oh yeah, that's a valid account. And then so it allows the logon to take place. But what happens then is with select accounts or groups, users or groups that you determine, then it can cache those credentials and including the password. Then on the next logon that this user makes, it's no longer going to go to this other domain controller up here to validate that account. Instead, that user's username and password is cached down here, and so it can do a direct authentication for that user account from that point forward. Okay, so it's not going to be forwarded after that point. Now, passwords for select accounts, again, it can be used individual users or groups. It's usually smarter to do it by groups. Those are going to be cached on our read-only domain controller. Now, high-level administrator accounts are usually not cached. We'll see that in the interface in a little while, but there are several groups that by default are not going to have cached passwords on that read-only domain controller, because if it does get stolen then of course we would have a lot of highly sensitive account passwords that were cached. And by the way, if somebody does steal that read-only domain controller, there's hackers' tools out there that can run against a domain controller, and through brute force attacks and a number of other methods, it could be able to determine what the passwords are for any passwords that are stored on that DC. Okay, if it becomes a compromised read-only domain controller, either electronically, someone hacked it over the internet or something like that, or somebody physically ran off with it, then any of the accounts that we have cached are now going to be vulnerable accounts, and you will have to have a recovery mechanism for that. And I'll show you how to do that. It's real easy, and it's pretty ingenious method actually on Microsoft's part. All right, having cleaned up yet again up here, let's take a look at another thing that goes on. You see, since this WAN link, maybe it's highly unreliable and really slow, and it goes down a lot. Well, when that happens, I might still need somebody down here to be able to perform administration. Or, even if the WAN link is still up, what happens if we get a huge update that we need to perform on this server? Maybe we get a big service pack that needs to be installed. Well, if it's hundreds of megabytes in size, I don't want to have to pull it down from maybe a WSUS server up here somewhere and over this really slow WAN link. So instead, what I might do is I might FedEx them a CD with the service pack on it, but I need somebody down here to be able to install that service pack on my read-only domain controller. Thing is, among my only 12 users, that doesn't really justify having a full-time IT staff person down there. So what I can do is I can give somebody a special purpose administrator role on this read-only domain controller, and they can fully administer it, whether it's installing software, updates, installing drivers, whatever it is that they need to do, partitioning hard drives, all that stuff they can do, but they don't have to be a domain admin. They're only administrators on this one read-only domain controller. So let's go ahead and take a look at some other information about that. I kind of getting ahead of myself here. This is something that we call administrator role separation. I can delegate the administrator role to any user I want. They don't have to be an IT professional, but they should be able to do what I tell them to do. Click here, type this in, so forth. You can identify who that user is in the DC promo answer file, because you can, of course, use an answer file to perform the installation. If you haven't done it in the DC promo answer file, or when you manually ran DC promo through advanced options and chose to create the read-only domain controller, you can also use a utility called DSMGMT. We don't need to really memorize how to use the tool or anything like that for our current purposes, but just be aware of the fact that that it's there and you can use it if you want to after the fact. The administrator role separation that we're talking about here only applies to the read-only domain controller. So once again, even if I make this person an administrator over the read-only domain controller, they have no control or privilege over any of my other domain controllers, which again is a big advantage, because if somebody runs off with this domain controller and with this account as well, which is normally also going to be a cached account, somebody that you have administrator role separation for on this read-only domain controller is normally also going to be an account that has cached credential here. That way, if this WAN link goes down, we still have somebody down here that can perform administrative actions on this domain controller, and we're not entirely orphaned. But once again, if somebody steals it, that account is going to be compromised, at least for the time being. And then once again, like I said, that administrator can do things such as install software, updates, drivers, perform other administrative tasks, partition hard drives, perform backups, whatever else it is that they need to do, they can do on that read-only domain controller. Now when it comes to installation, what are some things you have to keep in mind? One of those things is to install a read-only domain controller. You can do it physically through the UI running DC Promo. When you do that, there will be an option early in the wizard to choose advanced options. And this would be for the full edition of Windows Server 2008 as opposed to the Server Core. We haven't talked a lot about Server Core, but remember, Server Core is pretty much a command line only edition of Windows Server 2008, and by the way, also a great combo. So you will very often put read-only domain controllers on servers that are Server Core editions of Windows Server 2008. But anyway, you run DC Promo with the advanced options if you want to use the full interface on full editions. If you want to do this as well, you can also use an answer file that's also still useful even for full editions. And why is that? A lot of organizations that have a big hub with dozens or hundreds of different branch offices might put together an answer file to install a whole flurry of read-only domain controllers. And so it's going to make that a little bit easier. By the way, if you want to see some sample files for that, go to www.nuggetlab.com, and another series that I did for Windows Server 2008, which is the 70-640 series. You can download a zip file for that series, which contains several answer files for you that you can peruse and look through. It's more of an issue for that particular exam than it is for ours, so I just mentioned it to you so you can kind of get extra study there if you want to on that. Now, if you do decide to install a read-only domain controller on Windows Server 2008 Server Core, an answer file is necessary because you can't run DC Promo with the wizard because there's no next finish in a command line only operating system. So you have to use the answer file in that particular case. And then another thing you can do is to pre-stage your read-only domain controllers so that they go directly into the site that you predetermine, and also you can predetermine certain other factors about those read-only domain controllers. In fact, let's go ahead and show it. Here I am in Server Manager, and I've gone to my Domain Controllers Organizational Unit. Now, you see I've already, pre-staged a single read-only domain controller, but I'll do another one manually so you can see how I would do that. I would right-click here and choose Pre-Create Read-Only Domain Controller Account, and then I would click on Next. Once I've done that, I could go here and say, whichever credentials I wanted to use to create this. I'm okay with the ones I've already got. And then I'll enter in the computer name for this. I'll just say RODC2. Since I've already got an RODC1. Then it checks to see if there's another computer by that name already, and it's going to verify that. It'll come back okay, and then we'll proceed. And there it is. Then what we'll do is we'll tell it what site we want to associate this read-only domain controller with, and we'll click on Next. We'll say if we want it to also be a DNS server or a global catalog server. That's a pretty good idea in both instances there. So I'll go ahead and click Next there as well. Remember that DNS in Active Directory, if in Active Directory integrated zones, is normally a read-write copy of DNS as well, and it's also replicated around to our other domain controllers. But since this is a read-only domain controller, it'll still have all of the DNS zones that's replicated in Active Directory, but since it's a read-only domain controller, all that information is read-only. Now, let's go here and take a look at the group or user that we want to specify for simpler administration here. Now, I've already created a group called RODC admins, I think it is, and this would be a security group that I want to be able to fully administer a read-only domain controller. So I can click on Set there, and I think I called it RODC admin, something like that. It's going to resolve it here for me, and then it'll go ahead and plop that in there. Okay, so on this particular read-only domain controller, RODC2, anybody that's a member of that security group will be able to perform that administration that I talked about. Alright, so we click on Next, and that's pretty much it. If you want to, you can export the settings, and that'll put all the settings into a file that you can then use as the basis for an answer file. And there's a link there if you want more information about that. But I'm okay with what we've got here for the time being, so I'll just click on Next and Finish. Now, one thing that's very important to realize with this is that these read-only domain controllers that I pre-staged like this, notice that it says it's an unoccupied read-only domain controller, they have to be in workgroup membership. Okay, so there is already a server called RODC1, and it is a workgroup member. Also, at the time that I run DC Promo and actually install this read-only domain controller, it has to already be named RODC1 at that time. Now here I'm going to go ahead and go to my RODC1, and we'll run DC Promo and complete the process here. So I'll call this DC Promo. And then we're just going to go ahead and run the advanced options here. Again, you can do this from a command line, or you could do this on a server core installation. I couldn't think of the word for a moment there. And you could do either one, but I'm going to use the UI here so you can get kind of a full vision of all of the various options that you'll have available to you. I want to install this in an existing forest and an additional domain controller to this existing forest. And then I'll type in the name of the domain, which is nuggetlab.com. Okay, and then I can use alternate credentials for that. As someone who has the authority to be able to query against that domain, and we'll click on Next. And then we see that there's the domain right there. That's fine. Okay, and we'll click on Next here. And then we'll say, or rather acknowledge that the wizard detects an account for this as a read-only domain controller that matches the name of this computer. Now, if I did not already pre-stage that read-only domain controller, there would be an option in the wizard for me to checkbox that I wanted this to be a read-only domain controller. But since I pre-staged it, it allows me to do it this way and just click OK. Okay, and then I've got, a dynamically assigned IP version 6 address. That's okay for the time being, so I'm going to go ahead and say yes for the time being, even though the IP version 4 address is static. Now, at this particular juncture, I need to explain some things. You see, normally when we run DC Promo, it will pull data from an existing domain controller down to the machine that we are installing as a domain controller. That's because it has to get all the Active Directory data. Now, this can really be cumbersome over a slow or unreliable WAN link, especially if we've got hundreds of megabytes or more worth of data. I've heard administrators tell me that they have had to do some installations in branch offices that have actually taken days to actually pull the data across a slow WAN link. So what we can do instead is, let me just minimize this and show you what I can do. We can save all the data out of Active Directory and put it on something like removable media or a network share, something like that. I put mine on a thumb drive in this case, but I can use ntdsutil, and then I can choose to activate instanced. And I'm not typing the whole thing out. You just type in the first few characters, but it's activate instance and then ntds. Okay, and then what I can do is ifm, okay, and then I'm going to tell it to send this data to a particular location. And then what I'll do here is, and there's actually a few different commands you can use here, but I'll just go show a question mark to show you that you can do create sysvol RODC, which would include both the sysvol contents as well as including read-only domain controller data. Now, why do we specify read-only domain controller as opposed to full? Because again, RODC will not include the password. So I choose create RODC, and then I put in a directory of some kind. So c:\temp or whatever. Okay, I'm just going to put it there for the time being. Okay, and so we'll press enter, and we'll see it'll take a few moments, so I'll pause recording here, but it'll create a snapshot and it'll save all that data over to that location. Now, what I've already done, though, is I did that in a previous point in time where I saved all of that data, but I saved it to a thumb drive. So now what I'm going to do is to replicate the data from the following location. I got to see what my drive came in as, what drive letter it was. See, it came in as drive letter E on this particular server. It's on my drive letter E. So I'll browse, and I'll go to my drive letter E, and I think I created a, there it is, ifm directory, and there's an Active Directory folder that that ntdsutil created for me there. So now what happens here is I'm going to pull that data in from my thumb drive, and this might be a good idea if you want to send that into a FedEx to your remote office or on a burned CD or something like that. Then they can pull it from here instead of having to copy it all from a slow WAN link. Okay. Then I'll go ahead and click on Next. And it says the ntds.dit file does not exist. So let me browse that again. Let me go into this. And we'll go to this and click OK and Next. So it was actually in the root of that. I went too far down in the directory structure. And then on this page of the wizard, it tells us that I still have to pull some data from a live domain controller. It's just not going to be as much as if I use install from media. So I'll let the wizard choose an appropriate domain controller. DC Nugget 1 is fine anyway. So I'll just click on Next, and then the rest of this is pretty much the same stuff that we normally see. Hopefully I typed that password in right. The same stuff we normally see when we do a DC promo. And again, we can use an answer file for this and export the settings if we want to. So we just click on Next, and I'll usually choose to reboot it on completion. Once that comes back, we'll then have a read-only domain controller. And then while I'm waiting for that server to restart, we see that here as I refresh the screen that it now is identified as a read-only domain controller with a global catalog role on it. And if I double-click on this, here's just another place that you can also identify who's going to be administering it. If you go to the Managed By tab, notice that, as I mentioned earlier, the RODC admins are the ones that administer this. If you want to change that, you can, but you can only enter in one account. It's not like an ACL where you can enter in as many accounts as you want or as many groups as you want. When you click on change, you're done for good. Whoever you put in here replaces whoever you'd already had. Let's see, just go back and take a look, by the way, at who's in my RODC admins. In my RODC admins, I've got building 1 user 01. Okay, so that's the person that's going to be able to administer my Windows Server 2008 read-only domain controller, kind of my Johnny-on-the-spot ad hoc IT fella. Now let me also talk a little bit more about those passwords. You see, as I mentioned before, by default, nobody's passwords are going to be cached on that read-only domain controller. And we want it that way for security purposes to limit our attack surface if that server gets stolen. But if I go to the properties of the read-only domain controller, I'll notice some other interesting things. Notice that there's a deny setting for several security groups, like backup operators, server operators, administrators, other security-sensitive groups. Notice that there's also a couple of other groups here that denied read-only domain controller password replication group. They are also set at deny. Anybody that's set at deny will never ever have their password cached on this domain controller. Now let's go ahead and take a look at who's a member of that. So if I go down to users and denied RODC password replication group, we can see that sensitive security accounts such as enterprise admins, domain admins, and so forth are all included in that group membership. So we'll never cache any of these accounts, and that's very useful because we don't want to have cached an enterprise admin down there, for example, and then have someone steal the read-only domain controller and actually have their password. So then other things that we will have here, let me go back to my domain controllers. As we go back into the wrong account, let me go to the right one this time. The right account here on the password replication policy is I have the allowed RODC password replication. Now I can do this a couple of different ways. I can add in a specific individual user account if I want to, and I'm going to do it this time first that way. And I'll just say, I've got a building 1 user 01 account. I think I got that name right. Okay, so I got an account like that, and I'll add them in here. Okay, so that's my user account, and I want to be able to cache their password. Then the other thing I could do is to add in the membership for the read-only domain controller password allowed password replication group. So I'll go back into that down here and members, and I'll add in another account. How about my building 1 user 02 account? And that account resolves as well, so we're good for that. Okay, so I've added in the appropriate group membership there, and now I've got both of those going on. Now, here's the kind of a funny thing. If I click on the Advanced button, I can pre-populate this password. That user account has never logged on to that domain controller before, so their password is not cached. Even though we've got allow here, since they've never logged on before, it's not going to get cached yet. So I can click on Advanced, and I can pre-populate the account for that user. Thing is, it won't work initially. Watch this. If I click pre-populate accounts and I choose, building 1 user 01, then it'll say, do you want to send the current passwords to this domain controller now? Yes. And it says it first must be added to the allowed list. What? Huh? I just did that. So let me close that again. I've already added them to the allowed list. Here's the thing. You have to click apply first. Okay. Now, normally, of course, apply and OK just enact whatever settings you've enabled. However, OK closes the dialog box. Apply leaves it open. Now that I've enacted it, now when I click back over here, now I can click pre-populate passwords, building 1 user 01, and I can click OK. Now, you want to do this? Yes. Now it is pre-populated that account for this user. So they've never been to that domain controller, never laid hands on it before. Now we have an emergency. They can log on with their proper password. Now also perhaps you notice that there's a couple of other accounts that are already there. The read-only domain controller's password itself, computer accounts also have passwords. It's always included by default. It has to have its password. And the Kerberos ticket granting ticket account, which I mentioned earlier, it also has to have its password already cached by default. Another thing that's kind of interesting is I can specify not only to display users and computers whose passwords are stored on the read-only domain controller, but also who have been authenticated. I've logged on the trainer account already on that domain controller, and that just tells me who's been authenticated at some point in the past down there. So a very handy way of working with this and identifying where our passwords are stored. Now finally, be aware of the fact that there's something called the filtered attribute set. Now this is something that you can do to confirm that certain attributes within an Active Directory object are never replicated to the read-only domain controller, because not all of it is considered sensitive. Really, it's the passwords that are considered sensitive. However, you might have some kind of a custom application that also stores users' passwords that's also LDAP aware, that's also replicated along with other Active Directory data. If that data gets replicated to your read-only domain controller, then you could again have potential security vulnerabilities there. Or maybe you have like I said, a custom LDAP application that has other kinds of company secrets in it. Well, if you need to secure that kind of data, you need to go through somewhat of an elaborate process. I'm going to open up a web browser here and show you the URL. Just make note of this URL at tinyurl.com and then B7YBBB. And this is a Microsoft TechNet article on how to set the attributes for the filtered attribute set. This goes on quite a ways. It's well beyond our scope in terms of having to actually memorize this or something like that, other than to know that you can configure the filtered attribute set, and you can mark an attribute as confidential, and it will then prevent that attribute from being copied to a domain controller, a read-only domain controller. Alright, now let's assume that an emergency has happened. What do you do if someone has smashed in the windows in that branch office and run off with the domain controller? Well, probably it's in a pawn shop somewhere and nobody really knows what's on there, but we'll just have to assume that it could be a hacker that took that and has intelligence to be able to divine information out of it. So what we'll need to do now is to right-click on this thing and choose Delete. Now normally we would run DC Promo to gracefully remove a domain controller, but of course we can't do that now because we don't have that domain controller anymore. So we'll right-click on it and choose Delete, and we'll say yes, and it'll identify that it was a read-only domain controller, and that we should reset the passwords for any of the cached passwords that were on that domain controller. We can also reset the computer accounts if we want, and we can export those accounts to a file if we want to. And if we want to view a list of everybody that had cached passwords, we can do that. And offline, you see I logged on a couple of accounts there. Then we can also specify a location to put a hard copy of these compromised passwords. So I'll just click on my hard drive and I'll just put them in my temp drive, and I'll call this, compromised. It just saves it in a CSV file, and then I'll click on Delete. And then it tells me that we're going to have to reset our passwords for those accounts, and it's deleted all the metadata for the domain controller account. So that's pretty much it. We want to continue with this. It was also a global catalog. Do we want to continue with that as well? We say yes. Now that domain controller is gone, and it will no longer be of any valid use to us or anybody else. In this nugget, we talked about read-only domain controllers. We started off with a brief overview of what a read-only domain controller is, and some of the advantages of it, especially over slow WAN links, as well as isolated branch offices that might not be as secure and might not have as much of a full-time IT staff as you would in a hub office. We took a look at some of the prerequisites before you install a read-only domain controller, some important things to keep in mind there, as well as various considerations such as whether or not it should also be a global catalog server. And very often, you probably do want it to be one because of Outlook clients. We also took a look at credential caching. Remember, there are certain passwords that you can store on a read-only domain controller, although most of them will not be. Whichever password you decide to store on the domain controller should be the user accounts of people that might need to troubleshoot it. And by the way, it'll also need to be the computer accounts that those users will be using, and especially in case that they administer that read-only domain controller remotely using a Vista or an XP machine, for example. Then we took a look at administrative role separation so that those people that do have the administrative privilege on the read-only domain controller can do so. And we took a look at how to install a read-only domain controller, as well as a few select demos. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.